but Mr. Copple may have some more regional specific comments he wants to make.
Yeah, I think there have been, I think, some concerns in respect of some important provision that we contract in or that the NHS contract in for us in terms of healthcare and education and the particular providers, and there's been changes there and we're seeing improvements.
That was common to those in the southwest.
And we're seeing improvements, and that's encouraging in respect to those two establishments. And I think that there were particular labour market challenges for both to some degree. Exeter not as great as Bristol, but again, we've seen a generalised improvement across the whole system, including in the southwest over the last 12 months or so, and we're seeing improvements there. But they were factors as well.
And as the Minister says, you've got a lot of reception prisons. So also, I think 10 of the 15 are what you might term the adult male local prisons. A lot of them Victorian stock, and so on. I think that's fair, isn't it? What is it that makes those prisons particularly problematic? I understand for reception prisons you've got churn, turnover and so on. In terms of the other local prisons, anything additional that comes with it? Is it physical state of the building?
Well, I think the state of the estate is a factor, but there are equally, and Phil will probably be able to talk to them, some which continue to do well. So I think we've got to be careful about drawing or extrapolating a consistent or a general theme throughout. I think some of these, take Bedford, it's a relatively small establishment as well, compared to a lot of the other prisons, and that can again cause challenges with resilience and ability to deal with these things. The state of the estate, for me, is a concern, but that churn point, which you referenced, Chair, does make it very challenging when paired with the state of the estate. Old Victorian prisons, workforce challenges. In some of them, overall, we're seeing numbers go up, retention go up, but in some of these areas we are seeing challenges on a localised basis. I think you put those together and you start to see common themes that come out in the recurrent urgent notifications, and that's one of the pieces of work, as I say, I'm doing with the team at the moment to see if there are common themes. I spoke to the Chief Inspector about that recently.
Okay, I get that. That's all compounded by that lack of headroom you talked about. Okay. Ms Hopkins.
Thank you. Bedford Prison. It saw 533 self-harm incidents in the last 12 months, and that's the third highest across the prison estate. So just some questions around what steps you're taking to reduce that level of self-harm.
Thank you. Well, shall I give a headline, Ms Hopkins, and then Mr Copple may want to give more detail. And you're right to highlight those incidences of self-harm. One of the things we've done there is to seek to help staff identify risks and the triggers for self-harm in people who are entering Bedford. We've included coaching and upskilling on the assessment, care in custody and teamwork, the ACT case management model, and we're providing that through the National Safety Team as a specific intervention there. NHS England are also working specifically with HMP Bedford to review the self-harm pathway and particular intervention points, helping the prison to understand the reasons behind self-harm and hopefully improve both understanding but also the escalation and oversight when there is a heightened risk. We're also providing temporary funding for 12 months to help embed those new ACT processes and that learning. I take the point by the Chair, and I sort of slightly twisted and extrapolate from it, but I suspect his concern would be, well, that's 12 months, but what happens afterwards? Our expectation, our hope will be that those 12 months, the purpose of that funding is to embed those processes in business as usual, and it's part of the day job. But what I would say, and Mr Copple may have further comments, is we'll keep that under review, because incidents of self-harm are too high across the entire estate, particularly, and I'll be honest with the committee as I'll always seek to be, in the female estate. That's not for this session, but it's something I'm looking at very carefully with Mr Copple.
I mean, the only things I think to add are that we are investing in the senior management team to strengthen it and creating a couple of additional posts. And some of that will be directly helpful in either because one of them is around violence reduction, and tackling a lot of the factors around violence often helps with self-harm as well, because some of the drivers are the same in establishments. But also it'll increase the capacity of the safety team because they'll have less other general operational duties to cover because we've got a bigger senior management team in place in the establishment. Big drive to try and improve standards and really double down on that, as the Minister's touched on, and that will include considering standards coaching team deployment, which is a central resource that we organise of experienced and skilled staff to support staff in other establishments where they're struggling. And Bedford is one of those places that I think is got particular challenges because of a very high proportion of inexperienced staff. We've got a much higher proportion of inexperienced staff across the system than we did have. 30% of our officers now have got less than 2 years experience. It's a job where experience really counts as well. It's a problem I'd rather have than not have because it reflects success with recruitment. We've also improved retention, so hopefully we can build up the experience base of our staff going forward as well and make a difference in that. But we do need to support those places, and establishments like Bedford are above the national average in terms of proportion of inexperienced staff, so they do need a lot of help to try and drive forward these improvements.
And you've preempted a couple more questions, but I might sort of probe a little further. But thinking about those people who are vulnerable, what more can be done? Because there's the process, like I say, the discussion on entry, but actually some vulnerabilities, as you alluded to, the link between violence and self-harm, sort of come up whilst in prison. So is there anything else that you would be focusing on to sort of reduce that level of self-harm?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the overall action plan in response to the UN and the whole inspection is focused on a range of the key concerns, and that does include trying to improve staff-prisoner relationships. It does include trying to improve the regime as well. We need to make further gains with the staffing position to be able to do more, but we're hopeful of doing that. Even in prisons like Bedford that have had chronic challenges with staffing over recent years, we've got a pipeline going into 24, which is much more encouraging as well. But I think it is fair to say that there are system pressures that make it more difficult at the current time for reception prisons. I was at Bullingdon in Oxfordshire last week, and was being told about staff in reception still working very late into the night with late arrivals and so on. And so I think that I do recognise the fact that there are system challenges like that at the moment that make things more difficult and increase some of the risks. But we're obviously having to do everything we can with the more vulnerable sites like Bristol and Bedford and Exeter to try and do the basics as well as we can and raise the skill level of our frontline staff. We're also investing in the development of first-line managers as well to in turn try and support those staff. But we've had very positive feedback from staff, new staff, in relation to the system of new colleague mentors that we've introduced and the buddies of experienced staff to new staff that we've introduced. So these seem to be some of the factors that are helping with retention over the last year improve.
That's it. And it was mentioned in the adjournment debate a couple of weeks ago about, was it 15 new prison officers? And I was going to ask, are they new bums on seats, so to speak, or experienced officers? And you've sort of said that there is a level of inexperience with 30% under 2 years there. Yeah. Relaying back to what the chair was talking about where have these staff come from, or are they new recruits? Are we just pushing the bubble in the water around the tube? So by drawing staff in, are you going to be creating issues elsewhere?
Come on, let's say you're right to highlight, and Mr. Copple, is that in a sense it's a nice problem to have that we're 4,400 more prison officers than we were in 2016, but quite rightly, as you'll know, Ms. Hopkins, from prison service, police and similar, it's important to get that mix of experience and numbers correct. Our retention rates are improving, and I think that has, if I'm being honest, been helped by the 7% pay increase for band 3 to 5s in the last year, and essentially the salary going up from 23k in 2019 to 33k in 2023. That helps, but it doesn't solve all the problems. In terms of your specific question about those 15 posts, which are vacancies that need to be filled to boost that workforce, we've approved 4 national detached duty staff, currently experienced officers from HMPPS, to support them, and a further 3 prison officers on mutual aid, again, extant prison officers from HMP Little Hay, and we've just gone through the approval for operational support payments for the final 8 full-time equivalent band 3 detached duty to come in the short term as well. So that's roughly the mix.
Right, okay, thanks. And you talked about retention, and obviously the levels of violence against staff at Bedford have been the highest in England and Wales. So what emphasis will you place so that this doesn't hinder the sort of the retention generally, but also with the specific improvement needed in Bedford?
Yeah, it's a big focus right across the system, but we recognise it, particularly those places that we've had big gaps before, where we're making a bit of progress, that we don't want to still be recruiting the same volumes. We really want to be able to retain people, they gain capability and skill with experience, and it makes a big difference to the performance of the prison overall. So I mentioned a couple of things that we've done with the retention toolkit that we issued to governors, and lots of governors have run with that, done great work in terms of just some of the basic housekeeping, looking after people better when they first start, and the mentors and the buddies being assigned, and that's made a big difference. Lots of positive feedback about that. I mean, the resignation rate for officers 18 months ago was about 12.5%. It's reduced by about 3% now from that. It's now better than a lot of other public services. It's better than where we are across the labour market as a whole. So we're retaining people much, much better. I think it's a combination of looking after people better than we were. But also, as the Minister said, there's very significant improvement in where we are pitching salaries as a result of the recommendations of the Independent Prison Service Payee Body in the labour market than we were 2 or 3 years ago. So that's helping as well. But we need to get some of the basics in terms of leadership and looking after people right as well, to just exploit that to the full, that advantage that it's given us compared to where we were in terms of pay rates.
And if I just say one thing, Ms Hopkins, on that, and I should have said this in answer to your earlier question, but I suspect every member of this committee would just take the opportunity to pay tribute to the work that our prison officers do in very difficult conditions, but the best of times just in the nature of the work they do. And I'd actually also put on record my gratitude for, and I suspect Mr Copple would agree, the constructive approach the POA have had with us as a service in terms of airing what their members want to be aired, but equally working constructively with us. And I think it's important that while on occasions in this place we can be at loggerheads with various people, it's important we recognise where those relationships are constructive and positive. And I think Mr Copple's right, that pay is important, of course it is, but equally important to your question is that alongside that, it's pay, but it's also conditions, safety from violence, etc. And that's why, for me, tackling violence is a hugely important issue in our prisons. It remains a challenge, and there are many drivers of violence, as we know, on the estate, but we're very keen to do all we can to support our prison officers in keeping them safe. Just
to probe on that final bit about violence, what sort of measures do you think need to be taken or in train have been taken to reduce violence? Because you can have, like you say, the pay and rations here, but if your work environment's very difficult.
I mean, the drivers of violence are varied, and I think there are a number of things. One is we've got to make sure we address low-level bad behaviour, as it were, before it escalates or before people see it as acceptable. We've done a lot of work, and Mr Copple and the team have done a lot of work around getting, for example, the X-ray scanners in at gates of prisons, better searches and so on, to make sure that some of those things, illicit substances which can fuel violence either in themselves or through the trade that goes with them, that we can crack down on that. It remains a work in progress, and I suspect in the nature of keeping illicit substances out of the custodial estate, it will always be one of Mr Copple's top priorities. The other challenge we face, I think, is twofold, one of which we've talked about, which is that experience to numbers ratio among staff. When I first got this job, when I was doing it in female prisons and youth estate back in the day in 2018-19 again, Mr Copple was still there. And I remember one of the things he was telling me about was what he termed the importance of jailcraft, that innate experience that comes in officers from having seen it before, having dealt with it before, having learnt it. And the numbers going up is a good thing, but we've got to continue to build that. The other factor I just say is, firstly, in these prisons, particularly Bedford, but the other ones that have got the urgent notifications, as reception prisons, there's a lot of people who've just come in there straight from court. They're not settled, they haven't got into a routine. I suspect the staff are still getting to know them, and alongside that there will be a significant number, I think, of complex cases with serious mental health conditions. All of that coming together can make these challenging environments. But I don't know, Phil, if you want to add to that at all.
Just to say that in some respects we've got two main strands of focus at the moment to improve safety, that in terms of violence and self-harm and self-inflicted deaths as well at the moment. And we recognise that the scale of the challenges vary a bit, so some places like Bedford it's greater. But one of the areas of focus is actually about trying to do the basics much better, much more reliably, day in and day out. That's the focus on building the capability of frontline staff and first-line managers that I touched on. In terms of violence, that's trying to use the mechanism we've got, which is the more intensive case management we have for people who we identify as a raised risk of harming other people. It's the challenge and support and intervention planning that we do for those people. So that's a big part of our effort. A lot of what I said about mentoring, buddying, standards coaching, that's all relevant to that effort as well. So we're trying to focus on those basics and doing them very, very well, and making sure that inexperience or recent staffing gaps don't spill over into poor practice day to day. We try and raise our game in those areas. The other thing we're actively looking at is how it is that we may reconfigure some of our current spend so that we're spending more on the training and development of staff, both recognising the initial training and trying to improve that, but also the continuing professional development of people as well, and particularly first-line managers in relation to that, and reducing their spans of command. So we may be finding ways of doing that across the system, but we'll target some of these prisons to be in the first wave of those measures as well. Some of that stuff is very relevant to safety as a whole in terms of these challenges.
Thank you.
I should just say that recognising some of what the Chief Inspector has said, but and recognising the capacity challenges, but when I look forward, I don't feel pessimistic, because there are fundamental things about whether we've got enough people to run the system properly. And, you know, we had around 21,600 officers a year ago. We've got more than 23,000 now. It's a kind of fundamental thing. If you haven't got that, you're struggling with the foundations, and so many places start to deteriorate. And some of them are more challenged, deteriorate faster and to a greater degree. Well, what we've got in the pipeline looking forward does give me grounds for hope. Plus, we will invest in some of these basics and first-line managers as well.
My final one, reflecting that there was a UN for Bedford in 2018, things
Yes.
improved, but then here we are again. You've just portrayed a vision of hope. What assurances can we have around that maintenance of a positive outcome coming out of this UN?
Well, I think you're right to highlight this, and it's interesting to look again at the three that have had repeat UNs, which are Exeter, Bedford and Bristol, and what I said earlier about some common characteristics there, which we're going to focus in on. As the Chair has said, and I think it would be wrong of me not to acknowledge it, we are in the context of those very sustained national pressures, which, as I've openly acknowledged, do pose a challenge in this context. It's also brought a higher churn at Bedford, but with I think about 78% now on remand, which presents its own challenges. What we have done, and I hope what you've seen so far, is additional resourcing, additional funding. And I don't want to preempt the response that the Lord Chancellor is obliged to send, I think, by the 15th to the Chief Inspector. We will, of course, in advance of that, in confidence, write to the Chair for the committee, just letting him know what's happening. One thing I would highlight particularly there, which I think, or two things which are important, I think, to sustaining those improvements. One is about leadership and building that resilience in leadership. I was a school governor back in the day, became a school governor of a school that was in special measures, and we got it to good. And one of the single biggest things was having the right leadership team with the right approach in place, working with the rest of the team. And I think that's an important part in any prison of sustained improvement. The other thing which I just wanted to put on record is I know that some of the state of the estate issues at Bedford were highlighted by Charlie Taylor. We do recognise, for example, that the movement of the segregation unit remains a priority, and we've got an ongoing project to redevelop a new seg unit on B Wing, due for completion in the new year, at which point the existing segregation unit, which has been, and I'll be honest about it, much criticised by the Chief Inspector, will close and be replaced. It's taken longer than we'd have hoped, and I acknowledge that, but it's important that we also recognise the constraints we've run up against. It's a listed building, and that doesn't always make planning concerns easy, as the chair from his previous life in local government and beyond will know. But we're working through those, but as I say, I do commit to write to the chair on behalf of the committee in advance, setting out the full measures that the Lord Chancellor will be setting out in response to that UN.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Timson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to take you to Exeter, HMP Exeter, adult male prison, Cat B, local resettlement prison, I think capacity around about 321. First of all, do you know whether it's at capacity at the moment?
Yeah, all of the prisons in the estate that serve the courts, like Exeter, are running at their full operational capacity. The old adult male system is still above 99% occupancy at the moment. I should say Exeter as well has got a wing closed and has had for a while, whilst some refurbishment and fire safety improvement work takes place. So its full operational capacity will be very close to 500 when that work is finished.
And when are you expecting that work to be completed?
Not for a good period yet, a couple of years or so, because they're going from wing to wing to do the works.
So Exeter, as was mentioned before, is one of these recurrent urgent notification prisons. First in 2018, when it was described as unequivocally poor, which then was followed up by a whole raft of recommendations, which by the latest urgent notification in November of 2022, it was noted that against those recommendations in the 2018 report, 31% of those there had been insufficient progress, and 23% there had been no meaningful progress at all. So I suppose the first question is, what is your understanding of why there was a failure to act on those recommendations that then led to this second urgent notification at the end of last year?
Shall I say a few words, Mr Timpson, and then invite Mr Copple to come in subsequently? As you've highlighted, it was given an urgent notification in May 2018. It did receive an independent review of progress visit in April 2019, which acknowledged some, albeit slow, progress against that. The oversight was removed in April 2019, followed by a scrutiny visit, which took place during the pandemic in March 2021. So that noted that use of force was well managed, that during the pandemic violence had reduced. I mention that, but I also caveat it with that was a very odd time, as we all know, so I'm cautious about drawing too many conclusions. But they, as you say, they highlighted little progress in addressing the long-standing deficiencies in the care of prisoners at risk of self-harm or suicide. One of the biggest challenges, I think, at Exeter was that target staffing figure, which hadn't been achieved since 2018 until May of this year, and working with reduced staffing, if I can be honest, for such a prolonged period inhibited the ability of the prison to make that improvement and make the required changes. That was hit in May 2023, and I'm hopeful that increased staffing, reflecting the overall staffing numbers, notwithstanding the points Ms Hopkins made about the mix between numbers and experience, but I am confident that we will see from that changes. I would acknowledge that so to answer your question directly, one of the key factors there was not having as many staff in place during the action plan and during the attempted recovery of that prison as we would have wished. And I would also acknowledge that there was a degree throughout that period of instability in senior leadership roles, including changes to governor, deputy governor, head of safety. The challenge with that is if you've got something, you need to turn it around. You need a team that's going to see it through from A to B and sustain. And if you've got that churn, coupled with the pandemic, coupled with the staffing challenges, I think that's the explanation. That's not an excuse, but that's an explanation, I think, of where we've got to.
I think, in fact, since the first inspection, there have been 8 deputy governors and also 8 heads of safety, which is a a monumental turnaround in that short space of time, which any organisation is going to find difficult to provide strong and stable leadership, as the phrase goes. So what is being done now to improve the stability of leadership? What is the current situation?
A new governor was appointed earlier this year, so we're obviously hopeful that we will have the top leadership of the establishment in place for the next period. There has been some further churn, but that's because we have made a decision to strengthen the senior management team and increase the seniority of the grades of some of the key posts, so that we've got higher paid, more senior people coming into some of those key roles. But those posts have been filled now. So again, the intention is that new governor, some key new appointments will provide stability for the senior management team going forward in the establishment. We've obviously developed the action plan, which sets out a range of responses to the key concerns that were identified by the Chief Inspector.
Let me just turn to that action plan. It came off, obviously, the back of the urgent notification and the letter from the then Lord Chancellor, Dominic Raab. 28-day action plan. Within that are sort of due dates when all of these actions should have been completed. And looking through it, apart from CCTV in April 2024, the latest I could see there in terms of all the actions laid out in that action plan was December 2023, which lo and behold is where we are today. So have all the steps that were set out in the action plan now been completed to the satisfaction of you and those who are responsible for them?
I need to reserve judgment on that because we have got a further scrutiny meeting next month to judge where we got to by the end of this calendar year against the timetable. But we've got a strategy and action group that's been chaired by the relevant director, who is reporting good progress against the actions we've committed to. And then there's a senior board, and this is part of the post-UN scrutiny that we put in place as an organisation. That has been content with the progress that's been made in recent months since the inspection. But we will be looking again after a lot of the dates that are late 2023 to see where we are. But we've been pleased with progress to date and by the new governor in terms of what they've been able to put in place, and we've certainly delivered the support from the centre, from the wider organisation that is set out in the plan.
And at risk of promising something in Mr. Copple's name, would it be helpful in the new year, after that assessment of what was due to be done by year end, after that's been completed, if we were to write to the committee just with a brief update for you?
Yes, that would be very helpful, thank you.
Yes, I wasn't proposing on going through every single action, but I did note that a large number of them were early of 2023, so there should be a fair reflection already on whether there's any outstanding actions from that period. There's also, as with Bedford, the troubling issue around self-harm within Exeter, and between 2018 and 2022 inspections, there have been recorded 10 self-inflicted deaths and 1 non-natural death. So clearly an ongoing difficult issue. So could you say a little bit more about what work is being carried out to try and understand, first of all, what's driving the self-harm happening within Exeter Prison, and also what further work is being done to try and address it?
Shall I, as ever, give a sort of an outline answer to that, and if Mr. Copple wants to add to it, he will do. You're right to highlight this. All the data relating to self-harm is analysed by the local safety analyst and then scrutinised further at the monthly safety meeting. And as you alluded to, a safety and self-harm reduction action plan is in place and is now reviewed regularly. We're also undertaking regular reviews of the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman's action plan in consultation with the head and deputy head of healthcare. We are undertaking targeted interviews with the repeat and prolific self-harmers in the prison to understand the drivers and the triggers of self-harm and what is driving their behaviours. We've put in place a safer custody hotline, allowing for them and families to raise their concerns and to highlight particular issues. In one sense, I'd say we should recognise that the rate of self-harm has decreased by 41% there. But in the 12 months to June 2023, but quite rightly you would point out, as I would agree, that it was too high in the first place, and it still remains too high. The numbers are now 996 instances per 1,000 prisoners. Now that's still very high, and we need to continue doing the work. It's lower than prior to the first urgent notification. And I would highlight self-inflicted deaths have also decreased following the first urgent notification and have remained lower than pre-first UN levels. That's to highlight the fact. It's not in any way to hide the fact that there is a challenge there, and that number remains extremely high, and we continue through the work I've set out to seek to drive it down. But the trajectory is going in the right direction of driving it down, but I don't want for a moment to sound complacent that in not acknowledging there's a huge amount still more to do.
I think the only things I would add are a big push to improve the regime and time out of cell now that the prison is fully staffed as well, so that should help us in terms of self-harm risks. Big emphasis on additional training for staff as well in self-harm procedures, and again, as we touched on earlier, efforts to try and drive up standards in terms of day-to-day practice. One of the measures we've taken is a couple of additional staff who are like floor walkers who literally go around the prison all day coaching some of the staff in relation to managing people who are identified as being at risk of self-harm, and trying to make sure the planning process and the care and management of those individuals is as per procedure and has been done well. So a number of practical steps that were taken as well. Big improvement and good cooperation with health partners. Mental health services are improving. But one of the steps, which you may have noticed from the action plan that we took, was that we were concerned that from quite a large catchment area, prisoners who'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, when their conditions had improved and they were being returned to prison, they were being sent via Exeter for quite a large catchment area, and then it was difficult to move them on to other prisons as well. Exeter ended up holding a disproportionate number of those people. So we took the step to say that they couldn't be returned to Exeter for a period of time, and we must identify other more suitable prisons for them as well. That should also help, because a lot of those individuals were prolific self-harmers as well when they returned to prison.
Is that an HMIP survey showed that 77% of prisoners Exeter said they had a mental health condition.
Yeah.
Is that something that is now a falling percentage as a result of some of the actions that you just described, or is it too early to say?
It's too early to say in the sense of not having another survey data to compare, an independent survey data to compare it with. But the last measure that I just referred to will have the effect of reducing that proportion quite significantly, because there was quite a number of people who had been returned from secure psychiatric facilities that had kind of built up at Exeter as part of the population.
Well, I'd just highlight in that context, in terms of what we're doing about it, you may be aware that last December, so a year ago, we changed the healthcare provider from PPG to Oxley's, and as part of that recommissioning of the specification, we included a very clear review of mental health services and a focus on that. So as Mr. Copple says, it's probably too early, absent another survey, to come up with any hard and fast conclusions. But I am hopeful that those changes in that focus, or increased focus, will be beneficial in this respect. But I'd be hesitant to draw any statistical conclusions in the absence of any statistical data to draw upon.
The action plan, and again, I said I won't go through every aspect of it. I will go to this one though, which was in relation to mental health provision, was that a new mental health services model would be set up by March 2023. Was that achieved, and how has that changed the type of provision and support that prisoners are receiving?
Well, I'll say a bit, but I suspect Mr. Copple will probably add more light to this one than I will. But what we've done in the new model is to ensure that healthcare outcomes are monitored through the Local Delivery Quality Board, which takes place monthly. That covers healthcare outcomes more generally. There's much stronger engagement between the Governor, Commissioners and Oxley's senior team to ensure that the service is responsive, particularly around mental health. And we have healthcare, again with the focus on mental health as well, attending daily operational governors' briefings and providing input into necessary interventions. And I have to say, and Phil may have more up-to-date data, but the latest I had is that there has been 100% healthcare attendance at all ACT first case reviews around this. I'm looking at the mental health stuff. So the engagement is working. It's a much more active engagement, I think it's fair to say, than may have been the case previously. And again, without prejudging any future surveys, I'm hopeful that proactivity is making a difference. But Phil?
Not got much more to add to that. I think I mentioned what we were doing with healthcare and mental health services as part of the improvement in terms of self-harm efforts in response to the last question. That has been important, and the Minister's correct in terms of the healthcare input to the case reviews of people who are managed under ACT, the system for people who are identified as higher risk of harming themselves. That's come through. The new arrangements have been put in place earlier this year in the way that we committed to doing, and we are seeing improvements from that. But one of the things I would acknowledge, which kind of goes back to an earlier question from the Chair around some of the issues in the South West, is that sometimes our partners have significant recruitment and retention problems as well, and the mental health service provider has been in that position. So we would like to be further on, we would like the service to be even better, but we're on an improving path. It's just that they've got staffing challenges too.
On the 16th of December last year, the then Lord Chancellor, Dominic Raab, said in a letter dated that day to the committee, I think as a public letter, that I'm committed to ensuring that prisoners at Exeter should have the necessary and appropriate time out of cell to engage with a consistent daily programme of activity. So purposeful activity is sometimes known, but at the time of the inspection, only 29% of prisoners were in purposeful activity. So what improvements have been made to that regime to encourage purposeful activity and time out of cell, which is so important in part of the rehabilitation process?
Well, I can say a little bit if you want, if that's helpful, Mr. Timpson, and then Mr. Copple may want to come in. So we undertook a review of available activity places as reflected in what the former Lord Chancellor highlighted. Exeter is now working on the provision of 278 part-time activity spaces, some of which can be doubled up to effectively create full-time work, depending on the nature of the activity or the role. C Wing, which is by far the largest wing, we've now put in place a mirrored AM/PM regime, giving the opportunity for time in the fresh air and domestics for those who engage in purposeful activity. And for those not engaging in the regime, the core day links with the incentives policy framework. Delivery of the construction skills certification scheme cards was planned for October and November 2023, and as I understand it, has gone ahead. And our employment and education boards are, of course, as you'll be aware, now combined to review and allocate prisoners to clearly defined pathways. So there has been progress there, and you'll hear me say this a number of times this afternoon, I suspect. I think we're on the right trajectory and we're making progress. I'd rather it went faster and further, and we're determined to do that. But we have put in place what I think are the foundations that will enable us to do that.
And just to say, we've seen really more than a doubling of the proportion of prisoners in the prison that are taking part in activity at least half of the day from where we were previously, and that's been linked to the efforts but also the improving staffing position of the prison over the course of this calendar year. So that's pleasing progress, but actually we intend to go further. But in the way the Minister's just described, Exeter is one of those old reception prisons that one of its disadvantages is that there aren't enough activity places and facilities to occupy all of the prisoners all of the time, even if it was fully staffed and so on. So what we have seen is a big increase in part-time attendance at activity, and we're trying to have an even bigger proportion of people, over half now, but a bigger proportion in the near future, that are attending activity at least half of the time.
And it goes to a point we've made throughout, I think, Mr. Timpson, which three key points about the nature of, if I make the three reception prisons that are in that double notification bracket, and three key things. One, which Phil's just alluded to, which is space, the physical environment and the constraints of that. Two is staffing. Now we are getting staffing to a better position, which I think is one of the factors driving the improvement. And the other one is the challenge in the nature of that type of establishment, which is the churn, and that often you don't have someone there necessarily for a prolonged period during which they can embed themselves and get onto a course and actually sustain that engagement. Again, that's not excuses, but it's just an explanation of my understanding of the factors that are constraining what we're doing and the things we're doing to try and improve them.
So just on the constraints of the physical environment and the sort of physical structure of the prison, Exeter's been known for a very long time. You can go back 25 years or more of being a prison that suffers from overcrowding. And the inspection found that 85% of prisoners were living in shared cells designed for one person. But there isn't anything in the action plan that I could see that directly refers to how the improvements around living conditions and overcrowding will be addressed. So could you say what is being done?
I'll say a couple of things. Phil will know the detail, I suspect, more. And you're right that crowding has consistently been around 83-84% there, so roughly in that space. So you're correct to highlight that. One of the challenges with the site is it has a capacity reduction in place due to the ongoing fire safety improvement works. We're getting through those rapidly. Our expectation is that when they are done, that will help address these issues. A wing was completed in July of this year. C&E wings should complete in a bit over a year's time, in hopefully early 2025. That is a constraining factor, but we're doing those works, and in a sense we make no apologies for doing the necessary works, but that does impose a challenge. And it comes back, if I'm being very frank with the committee, to the point made by the chair at the start of this meeting, which is I would take you back to that broader context of the capacity pressures across the entire prison estate and the impact that that is having. So you've got that macro challenge which we are seeking to address, but at a local level we are working through those improvement works to bring those cells back into use, which will hopefully help ease that overcrowding and that capacity challenge on a local basis. But
yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of the context of the system, as the Minister's touched on, we're not in a position, even where it might be desirable, to reduce crowding or to temporarily close wings other than when it's essential. So the fire safety works at Exeter are an example of essential upkeep and maintenance work and fire safety improvement work. And we've got a public commitment that by the end of 2027 we'll have every prison in the country meeting current fire safety standards, with those modernisation works done, not having mitigations in place as we do at the moment by using domestic smoke detectors, for example. That's an enormous programme. Despite the capacity and population pressures, we've maintained that programme. We currently have around 1,500 places out of use. The wing at Exeter is an example of that, because it's so important that the work's done, and it reflects critical safety commitments that we've made as an organisation and that ministers have made. So we're not stopping the works and we're not filling up those wings, even though the places would obviously come in handy. The system has reviewed crowding. We've reviewed crowding across the whole system, and we've challenged ourselves about ensuring that we're maximising the crowding on the same basis across the system. So we've not been in a position to reduce crowding. We've actually increased crowding by around 900 places across the whole system over the last year or so. So there are a number of prisons that are having that additional challenge from having more prisoners in them because of those situations and the overall capacity position for the system. So in response to these UNs, we've not been in a position to try and reduce crowding or close wings over and above. We've only done that where it's essential. We have closed accommodation more recently at Woodhill. It was after the urgent notification, and it wasn't really because of the urgent notification. If we'd have been applying those kind of measures in order to try and avoid urgent notifications and because it was desirable, we would have closed it a lot earlier because of the chronic and acute staffing problems at Woodhill. But we got to the point where it wasn't just desirable, we regarded it as unsafe not to continue as we were. So we've closed 2 wings in recent weeks at Woodhill, and we now have 240 places out of use there. This is a contrast to what we were able to do a few years ago when we had UNs. Because at Exeter, for example, at Wormwood Scrubs, for example, we took out 250 places. At Wormwood Scrubs, at Birmingham, we took out 350. At Liverpool, we took out 500 places because we had headroom in 2017, 2018 to do those kind of things. We've not really been in a position to do that.
We'll come on to Woodhill in a moment. Just finally, if I may, Chair, when we had the Chief Inspector in, Charlie Taylor, to give evidence to the committee 2 weeks ago, he said in relation to Exeter that he felt it was making some very fragile progress. Now, of course, we spoke earlier about 2018 and some very fragile progress that was made then, which then unfortunately went backwards and led to a second urgent notification. So how can you give the committee the confidence it needs to believe that it's going to be different this time?
Well, I think we've got the lessons learned from the places where we made sustained progress, and how much of that can we do now within the constraints that we've talked about. But what we've learned from Birmingham, Nottingham, Liverpool, Woodhill and Scrubs about a range of measures to improve leadership management and a focus on the basics, and because as we saw between 2017 and 2020 before the pandemic, we had an improving staffing position across the system, and we saw improvements that we were able to sustain. I think we're in that position now that we're seeing staffing improvements, so we have more confidence about being able to sustain the progress now. I think we've also got some reception prisons that we can share some good practice from, which we've touched on earlier. And again, they're not places that have got wonderful facilities, but they've not had the same staffing challenges, and they've been able to make good progress with good leadership, which are places like Swansea and Preston, and they've had good inspections this year. So we've got that to learn from as well. But I feel more confident looking forward because Exeter is going to have much better physical conditions. When the fire safety works are finished on a wing and it moves to the next wing, those wings are also being refurbished and they're much better conditions. We've got a new leadership team in place that we hope to have in place for a good time to come, and the staffing position is much better than it was a couple of years ago, as the deterioration affected lots of prisons across the system.
Thanks very much. We're going to move to Mr. Ali and Bristol.
Bristol, yes. Bristol received its first urgent notification in 2019, which showed signs of improvement following 2 inspections. But then it received a second urgent notification earlier this year. So why did the 2019 action plan fail to deliver the long-term improvements at the prison?
Shall I kick off, Mr. Ali, and then Mr. Copple may wish to come in? I think there were a number of specific events and circumstances at Bristol that affected the long-term delivery of improvements and the sustainability of them. The COVID pandemic, as we all know, provided a unique set of circumstances that actually meant the prison was able to demonstrate stability and progress, but I would suggest here that that was in a sense provided a degree of false comfort because of the unique experiences the whole country was going through at that time, because that time the prison was able to do was that a restricted regime by necessity during the pandemic meant prisoners were managed in small groups without mixing across the prison, so reducing violence levels. Staff absence improved, save where there was an outbreak of COVID, so you have more stable working. Staff retention stabilised because, as we know from what we saw then, the nature of the employment market externally and other opportunities was significantly diminished. And drug ingress reduced, partly, I suspect, due to a lack of social visits and the other restrictions that were put in place. And there was a reduction in operational capacity. So the reality is, I think we saw improvements at that time, but they weren't stress tested in normal conditions, if that makes sense. So potentially providing a false sense of where it had got to, meaning we felt, okay, this is going in the right direction. The reality was, I think, once the prison progressed out of COVID restrictions in 2022, you saw the job market pick up again. having an impact on the prison's retention of staff. We saw the prison increasing unlock levels by opening up its regime, a good thing, but then seeing levels of violence increase and similar. And I think we saw increases in the sort of drugs and illicit substances that are some of the drivers of violence and instability in a regime, and leading to an increase in self-harm as well. And I think equally pressures in the different services, community service provision post-pandemic, as other services recovered, meant we saw an increased vulnerability in the prisoners who were coming into Bristol. So the short answer, Mr. Ali, and Mr. Copple is entirely at liberty to contradict me if he thinks I've got it completely wrong, is that you saw progress during the pandemic, but it was in a unique set of circumstances, possibly masking the fact that that wasn't actually long-term sustained progress. And we're now at a point where we are seeing those challenges still extant, hence the second UN. There is work to do to address those, as it were, in normal times, in normal circumstances, i.e. now. So I think in that sense, if I'm being honest, I suspect there was a sense we'd made more progress than we actually had because of the unique conditions prevailing in the country at the time. But Mr. Copple may wish to add to that.
I think that we've touched on some of this already, but just taking a step back for a minute, think about the whole system, but then certain establishments, institutions within it, as we've talked about, that are more vulnerable, less resilient. I think Bristol's a good example of that. I think that we did see significant improvement at Bristol after the urgent notification. A lot of effort was made to support the prison. We had good leadership and good initiatives and good support from the wider organisation. In that scrutiny visit in 2020 that the Minister referred to, the Chief Inspector described it as a much improved establishment. But I then think as a system, what we saw, as the Minister touched on, was a tightening of the labour market and a general deterioration in the staffing position across the prison service. And then some places experienced that to a much greater degree and had much more deleterious effects than others. And Bristol and others in the southwest were an example of that, where it hit harder and their staffing deterioration was significant. There was also a degree of discontinuity in terms of leadership, which was quite natural. The governor and some other managers moved on, were promoted, got bigger jobs, and some new people kind of come in to take the place forward. But then we experienced significant challenges in the labour market, as we've touched on, and we've seen some challenges in safety across the system as a whole during this period. But as I say, I'm kind of hopeful about the future because the fundamental building block of the staffing position is improving significantly. We are supporting that prison again, but we've got some big safety challenges and we need to try and build capability with frontline staff because a lot of them are new. But I'm confident that we can do that and we can share good practice from the similar prisons that have been doing well in other parts of the country, South Wales and the North West being examples with Swansea and Preston.
The action plan stated that a review of the ACT process for prisoners identified as being at risk of suicide or self-harm was due to be completed this year by September. What were the findings of the review?
So I'll start with Mr. Copple again. We'll probably add the detail that may be more interesting to you. So we did undertake an independent peer review of the ACT documents within the prison as we said we would, and at the time of their visit there were 39 open ACT documents across the prison. 17 of these were reviewed as a sample, and the issues identified were ongoing records not being subsequently updated, key risk factors not always being identified, support via access to family members for those in need not always being clear, support actions not always identified or updated, and for those with specific needs, invites to case reviews for relevant departments were not routinely made, and indeed reviews for those segregated were not always on the correct documentation. In terms of the improvement actions we've undertaken, which I think was where you were going with, so i.e. what have we done, they have included floor walkers, which actually in a sense is an understatement. What they are, they're trained specialists who conduct daily checks of all Open Act documents where they collate assurance and compliance and check that. Any findings are immediately challenged and addressed with upskilling and support given to those staff identified. The senior management team weekly checks to provide further assurance. The national safety team attended, as you allude to, HMP Bristol in July 2023 and in October of this year, where upskilling around risk and triggers was provided to all case coordinators within the establishment. We've put in place and reinforced process improvements for quality assurance. Multidisciplinary attendance at case reviews specific to individuals' needs has been reinforced. Safer Custody has daily oversight of all open acts and as I say, has assigned case coordinators. But I would say that what remains a concern, notwithstanding all those actions we've taken, is that Bristol is now effectively, and this is a concern to me, potentially a cluster site for self-inflicted deaths, having experienced sadly 2 in the previous 8 weeks. But that's a summary, Mr. Ali, of what we found and what we're doing about it. But again, Mr. Copple may want to add to it.
No.
The Chief Inspector found that Bristol was one of the most unsafe prisons in the country. What will you do differently to ensure that the proposals in the action plan drive change?
Well, I'll give a headline, if I may, Mr. Ali, and then again, Mr. Copple may want to come in. So the prison safety strategy does take a holistic approach to improving safety outcomes at Bristol, including a focus on things like staff training and development, going to the point, quite rightly made, by Ms. Hopkins again, about experience and that jailcraft, that understanding of it. And safety and security are not are two sides of the same coin. They can't be really separated, and it's a sort of thing saying that security is not a dirty word in this context. It's got to be front and centre of what we're seeking to do. There's a further focus on effective communication, purposeful activity in reducing reoffending, and crucially to some of the points made by other members of the committee, mental health and healthcare services for prisoners, with a focus and a prioritisation of key work. We've also, and this is an element of it, we've invested in staff to help support that regime and that safety in the prison to help drive down incidences of violence. But I don't know if Phil wanted to add anything to that.
Not too much. Just to acknowledge that
Chief Inspector did say that the strategies currently employed to reduce high levels of violence, self-harm, drug misuse were not having the intended impact. Things being done differently now to make sure that impact is happening in them.
Well, I think that there's 3 points I'd make, if I may, Mr. Ali. One of them is, and it's been a running theme throughout what we've spoken about today, which is investment in staffing and additional support to manage safely activities out of cell, and those increased staffing numbers across the system are one of the key drivers, I think, of improvement, and we're starting to see those coming through now. I suspect that they have come through too late for them to be recognised in the context of the Chief Inspector's comments there, but I do think they're driving an improvement. We're increasing the scrutiny for continuous improvement at regional and area executive director level, so there's that strategic oversight. But also we are ensuring the process for a future exit from the prison's performance support programme, that intensive support that's there, is as robust as possible to ensure that before a prison can exit from it, improvements are genuinely embedded as specific focused resources extracted back out again once the immediate issues are dealt with, to make sure it's embedded in that business as usual. Taken together, I believe that they will start seeing changes to reflect what the Chief Inspector wants to see, but I think they probably haven't had enough time to come through before he made his comments, would be my assessment, Mr. Ali, but I don't know if Mr. Copple wants to add.
No, I think the only thing I would say is a similar theme to some of the other places, the big focus on some of the day-to-day delivery and adherence to good practice in what we're doing, which are facilitated and supported by the mechanisms the Minister outlined. So there's been a lot of support from the centre of the organisation and the wider organisation to try and improve practice at Bristol, and we will monitor it very closely in the way that the Minister's outlined.
My final question is around overcrowding.
Yeah.
Because the Chief Inspector's report found that almost half of all prisoners lived in overcrowded conditions. Now, this is true within the prison estate generally, but specifically what is being done to address this at Bristol?
So Bristol, in a sense, is... I don't think you can entirely separate what's happening in Bristol from the overall picture of capacity and the challenges in terms of capacity around the overall prison estate. In terms of challenging the demand, changing how we do things, you'll have seen the Secretary of State statement on the 16th of October with a different approach in terms of short custodial sentences and the presumption of strong community sentences, subject to the will of the House, of course, in the legislation currently being debated. But in terms of supply, we've committed, in the long term, we've committed to building an additional 20,000 prison places. We've delivered around 5,600 of those already. So we've got 2 of those prisons built. One is currently in build. One very recently was given planning permission after a lengthy delay by the Secretary of State. I will be slightly cautious because I don't know if we're still in the period in which a JR may or may not be possible about that, so I'll just be a little cautious on that. And there are 2 remaining prisons of those 6 that will make up the 20,000, which are still subject to planning disputes, and one I think the Secretary of State has in front of him. There's another one that's due to be considered, I think, reheard from March of next year. So we are making progress in terms of the long-term investment. And alongside
What
that...
about prisoners abroad?
What about Bristol?
Well, I talk about Bristol or prisoners abroad. I'll answer
You're going to need to speed up a bit.
I'll answer the chair's point, but you may want to come back on that one. We are also, alongside that, creating thousands of additional places through the expansion of prisons with additional house blocks, refurbs, and by rolling out rapid deployment cells across the estate, with the first around 380, 400 already delivered at 6 sites. So we're doing shorter term capacity increases, but there's also that long-term strategic increase in the capacity. And you will have seen, Mr. Ali, the announcement by the Secretary of State that, subject to legislation, that's something he wishes to consider and reflect on.
Okay.
So,
just to say so quickly, if I can, the crowding level at Bristol isn't
Yes.
typical of
Bristol.
the whole system. It is around half the prisoners there living in crowded conditions. The whole system is about a quarter of the population. And it's no coincidence that 6 of the 7 adult prisons that have had urgent notifications are reception prisons, because that's where the crowding is concentrated. It's one of their challenges. It's one of the reasons why they are more vulnerable to the performance challenges that we're talking about.
Okay. I'm anxious that we move on because we're going to get votes before too long. Let's see, we've got one of the front benches already speaking. Let's move on to Sharpisham. Cookham Wood we mentioned already. Now, Cookham Wood's different, isn't it? Because it's a modern prison, comparatively. It's not overcrowded. It wasn't overcrowded at the time of the URN. As you say, Mr. Copple, it's got even fewer people in there. So that's not its issue. It's physical conditions, not its issue. But when we had the URN, some 71% of the people, of the prisoners in Woodhill said that they felt unsafe. And it had very high rates of self-harm and disruptive behaviour. According to 71% unsafe at some point. West half said they're currently unsafe, and the IMB says that violence and self-harm has got worse since the URN. So that seemed to be going in a bad direction, but without those aggravating factors that we've identified in the previous prisons. What's the problem with Woodhill?
So yeah, I mean, Woodhill amongst the adult system is an outlier in the sense of it's the only reception, it's the only adult prison received a UN that wasn't a reception prison, so to date. It was previously a reception prison and was re-rolled to a Category B training prison last year. I visited the establishment shortly after the inspection, and I've been personally involved with others in formulating the action plan. I mean, my honest view is that in terms of what we need to do with Woodhill, and the main driver of the problems is that virtually all the roads go back to staffing. There are
chronic shortage is referred to, isn't it? Chronic shortage is referred to by the
inspector. Woodhill has been one of the prisons that we have that has had the most acute and chronic staffing challenges. I touched on earlier the fact that we've got 240 places out of use at Woodhill at the moment. So that's in the middle of our capacity challenges. We've closed that many places at Woodhill. That's how worried I was about it. So it kind of demonstrates how severe those challenges are. There are some issues where if the management team had not been so consumed with just trying to manage the day-to-day, that I'm sure we would have been doing better work on more focus in terms of cleanliness and so on. I accept that. But particularly for a long-term population that it's managing, the regime that we've been able to offer has just not been good enough and is not consistent with safety or stability. And that's why we decided to close 2 more wings.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not without hope though, because we're seeing in these establishments, Bullingdon's another one like that. I was there last week, as I mentioned. We've got a pipeline going into 2024 that is much more encouraging and much healthier than we've had in the past. So a combination of, you know, the pay awards and what we're doing with the big spend on recruitment and advertising, and the first time we've ever had a national TV advert campaign as well. We are starting to see some benefits from that, so I'm hopeful about the future.
Staffing is a big issue. Well, the inspector was concerned it wasn't actually fulfilling its function as a training prison because of the amount of time, lack of purposeful activity, lack of education and so on. What's being done to address that?
Well, this is why closing the 2 wings was felt to be essential, because that gives us the building block to start trying to move forward, rather than just firefighting day to day without enough staff to run the number of places we're trying to run there. So we can start to make it safer and provide a better regime for a smaller population at Woodhill.
Okay, that's great. Mr Timpson.
Thank you, Chair. The education in Cookham came in for quite a lot of criticism, and in particular that there was a lack of qualified teachers, especially on vocational courses, and the skills and work opportunities were also inadequate. So what's being done to address this, alongside the issue of time out of cell, which is obviously going to be part of the solution to improving education, skills and work provision within the YOI?
I'll give a headline and then Mr Copple may want to come in. In terms of, to take your second question first, if I may, Mr Timpson, increasing time out of room, particularly time out of room spent in education, is a key objective, and we've redeployed staff from other establishments to help facilitate this, creating an interim staffing profile to respond to the current staffing level, reduce the population and living areas of the establishment, and revise the resourcing model to make the very best use of the staff we've got to maximise the time out of room. We're undertaking a further resource review to explore opportunities to make better use of the staff, again to improve a more stable daily out-of-room timetable, and that's due to commence at Cookham in early 2024. We're also reviewing keeper parts to improve the regime, with a focus also on reducing the number of smaller groups operating in each living area. One of the challenges we face with the youth estate is that with a much smaller number, in a small number of institutions in the youth estate, it's harder to have key parts in different establishments, and therefore that does impact on the regime within a given establishment. In terms of improving the quality of education, which I know you're also concerned about, I think was the first half of your question, senior leaders and the contracted education provider and YCS headquarters are working collaboratively to improve the allocation process so that all children have the opportunity to access a wider range of activities and learning opportunities. And the YCS head of learning and the head of learning skills manager are working with the YCS heads of education skills for each site to try and work with those providers to develop knowledge within and delivery of an effective curriculum. The starting point for that is English and maths and the basics there. And I would say where a provider consistently fails to meet the required performance standard, we are entirely open and willing to use formal contractual levers and remedies such as improvement notices to drive up specific performance, be that related to staffing, quality of educational outcomes or the mix. But Mr Copple.
The only thing I would add quickly is a big focus on the behaviour management strategy at Cookham Wood as well, which will enable more children more safely to spend time out of the rooms and in personal activity and particularly education, as well as making it safer more generally. But that's a big focus for us.
And that is a challenge because, as you'll be aware, we've gone down, it's a positive thing, from around 3,500, I think, in the youth estate down to about 500, or fewer than 500 now. The challenge with that is you have a concentrated cohort often, or largely in there for very violent and challenging offences, which can make it, especially with a smaller estate, can make it challenging. But that's exactly why, and I should have mentioned earlier, why Mr Copple's focused on the safety and violence reduction work.
Well, but based on the urgent notification 2023, where safety was rated as 1, which is poor. Clearly that needs to be the focus, with the levels of violence increasing. And also, very worryingly, the weapon making becoming a prominent issue, with 228 weapons found in the last 6 months, which I think anyone who wasn't involved in the prison estate would find really quite shocking, as well as violence against staff. So one of the responses to that was a commitment by HMPPS to recruit experts to identify the causes of this increasing use of weapons. So what were the findings of that, and what's being done in response?
We're still in the process of doing that work with partner organisations. We've taken steps to try and have a much more rigorous searching regime in the establishment. We did lock down the institution in the summer and carried out a full search, and with big emphasis on intelligence gathering and acting on intelligence about any weapons being manufactured across the establishment as well, for the safety of everybody. But we are, part of the improvement plan for Cookham is actually to work with the experts, as you say, but to try and inform the behaviour management strategy in the round, as well as some of the cultural drivers which really sit often in the community about why children feel the need to be armed with a weapon, because that's kind of habitual for them in many cases in their day-to-day lives in the community, and it's been translated into custody as well.
And part of that has been undertaking a safety summit to listen to the staff, but also the young people there, to understand better what those drivers are. That's driven a local safety strategy, within the context of which we've implemented a weapons strategy. Phil talked about the search that took place in 2023 in June, which I think is important. But the other three things I would highlight is, one, a more regular use and greater use of search to find any illicit weapons. Secondly, the reduction of the population from 120 places to 90, allowing hopefully a more consistent regime to be delivered, hopefully helping take the temperature down that can often rise when a regime is unpredictable or expected, time out of cell or similar isn't delivered. And the third bit is greater use of the incentive and earned privilege scheme in this context for good behaviour. So taken together, you've got in a sense, the tougher side of it, the supply side of finding any weapons, doing those regular searches. You've got the incentive to better behaviour through the IEP scheme, and you've also got that focus on a more consistent regime to try and remove some of the drivers of the frustrations or the tensions that in an establishment like that can boil over.
Just on managing children's behaviour, the UN report also found at Cookham there was an increased use of solitary confinement, which was deemed to be a serious concern. Based on what you've just said, is it your expectation that will now decrease?
So, I mean, and again, Phil will be the technical expert. I need to be a little bit, and it will appear a little bit pedantic, but I want to be careful about terminology, which is that we don't use solitary confinement as a way to manage children's behaviour in the estate. There may be circumstances where young people cannot mix with other young people on the basis of risk to or from others, and therefore they're separated. But we're making all efforts we can to reintegrate these young people as quickly as possible to broader interactions, to a normal regime, so that maximum access to that regime's possible. We've appointed a site lead to oversee those children and young people who are separated, and they have supported oversight and reintegration planning for each of those children, which has shown in those cases where they've directly intervened a downward trend in the number of separations. So I'm hopeful that we can see that more consistently applied and continue that downward trend.
You're going to have to leave it there, Chair.
I think we've got a division now, and realistically there'll be two divisions. There's a couple of factual issues that we want to raise with Cookham Wood in relation to retention support and what's happening with that, and the general issue about education provision across the YOI estate. Perhaps if we put those to you in writing, you could update us on those. That seems
I'm always happy to respond to the committee.
Sensible way forward, and we've identified, I think, some of the thematic issues around staffing, overcrowding, and so on. So I think we've probably touched upon those matters. So, gentlemen, I'm very grateful to you for your time and your evidence today. The session is concluded. Indeed, that's the last session of this committee for 2023. So I can wish everybody here a very happy Christmas and New Year, and we will see you in 2024.
Thank you, Chair.
Chair.
Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.